The Western Cape Police are hosting an official memorial service for the late Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear, who was murdered 2 weeks ago. The top anti-gang unit investigator was gunned down outside his home in Cape Town. One arrest has been made in this case. Newsroom Africa's Athi Mtongana joins us live. A very good afternoon to you, Athi. What has transpired at the memorial service today? And we believe that there was also a press briefing that was held.
It's interesting that you mentioned, Tammy, that one arrest has been made in this particular case. We spoke to the provincial commissioner, Matakata, and she spoke to us about how more arrests are expected to be made in this case. Remember, Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear was a top anti-gang investigator here in the Western Cape, and they have reason to believe that it was not just a murder. They believe that he was assassinated. In fact, the MEC for Community Safety, who was delivering the keynote address this morning, coming out to say that this assassination is a turning point for gangsterism in the Western Cape. We know that organized crime is rife in the Western Cape. It was not too long ago before the Minister of Police, was here to deal with the issue of extortion. We know that most of these extortion cases are done by a syndicate that has been forcing restaurants and some of the clubs in Cape Town to pay protection fees. And so Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear was working in cases similar to that, organized crime cases in the Western Cape, high-profile cases in the Western Cape. And so they have reason to believe that he was assassinated. In fact, the suspect that is currently in custody at the Belleville police station is Zane Killian, a former professional rugby player. They have reason to believe that he bugged Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear's phone to track his movements. We saw images, of course, of the suspect who fired shots at close range outside his home when he was still inside his vehicle. When it was parked outside, we saw him roaming the street. So he obviously got word that he had just pulled through the street, and that's when he, of course, walked closer to fire those shots. But of course, this morning it was all about remembering the life and times of Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear, who dedicated his life to the South African police and making sure that those that are responsible, particularly for organized crime in the Western Cape, are put behind bars. And most of the speakers here saying that the legacy that he left should continue, and that people within the South African Police Service, within the crime intelligence in the Western Cape, should not focus on the factions that are seemingly taking place within this province, that they should rather focus on fighting organized crime, because while they fight as a crime intelligence unit within the SAPS in the Western Cape, some of them are getting killed. And we've, of course, saw Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear getting killed even after the protection outside his home was withdrawn. So, of course, a lot of the speakers today talking about his dedication to the work, and police coming out to promise that more suspects will be arrested for this murder.
Athi, you mentioned there the issue of factions, even within the crime investigations ring. Any word, any progress as to perhaps the reasons why the security was removed from Kinnear's home?
That was one of my first questions, because the provincial commissioner, Matakata, is often not in this province. She's currently on leave, but she made sure that today she's here to attend this memorial service, because it's not just any police officer that was gunned down. This is a top investigating officer who made sure that all those that are operating within the organized crime unit in the Western Cape are put behind bars. So she came, I asked her, what about the fact that police decided to withdraw the protection of this top-ranking police officer in the Western Cape? She, of course, pointed to the fact that Police Minister Bekele promised that that would be investigated, and she said that they will also be looking at protecting not only senior SAPS officers but other police officers, whatever ranking they are, because she was saying how immediately, if you're wearing blue and you're wearing that uniform, you're immediately a target. We've seen so many other police officers being shot and killed in this province, but of course this one in particular looking like it was an assassination, looking like they intended to kill him, they planned his murder. And so one of the things, of course, that will be looked into is why his protection was withdrawn. And looking at how the MEC for Community Safety, Albert Fitz, was talking about how the crime intelligence in the Western Cape should rather focus on fighting crime as opposed to the infightings within their ranks. It speaks to the 59-page long complaint that Lieutenant Charl Kinnear wrote in 2018-2019, detailing how the crime intelligence in the Western Cape has a rogue unit, and he ended up singling about six top-ranking officers within the crime intelligence here in the Western Cape. And the recommendation that came from the Western Cape before this complaint reaching to the National Office of the National Police Commissioner, Ketla Sithole, was that this crime intelligence unit should rather be disbanded so that investigations can take place. But of course, those complaints will form part of this investigation to look into whether or not this rogue unit was part of his murder. There's so many questions in this case, and yet there are little answers. But of course, on the 5th of October next week, Zane Killian, the first suspect in this murder case, will appear before Magistrates Paul at the Bishop Lavis Magistrates Court. He is charged for 3 counts, one that of murder, the other one conspiracy to commit murder, and the other one the unlawful interception of communication. Tammy.
You mentioned there, Athi, the rogue unit within the police that Kinnear was investigating. Do we know whether those investigations are still underway? What is the status of those 6 as it stands?
He wasn't investigating them in particular. He wrote them as part of his 59-page long complaint to the most senior SAPS officers in the province and divisionally, so that they can be aware that if something happens within their ranks, they need to investigate. They need to look at the credibility of the crime intelligence in the Western Cape, because there were so many questions around corrupt police officers. This is not something new. Police Minister Bheki Cele has often said that they cannot tolerate corruption within their ranks, because they, as police officers, are mandated to deal with criminals. And if criminals are found within their own ranks, that should be investigated. And that was basically what Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear was complaining about in that particular complaint when he sent it to the various senior SAPS officers. He was only investigating, of course, those high-profile cases which include Nafiz Modek, who's known as one of the kingpin leaders of the organized crime syndicate in the Western Cape. He is responsible for the arrest of many kingpins in the Western Cape who form part of the organized crime unit here in the Western Cape. And so his life was always at risk. His life was often threatened. And so when he wrote that complaint, he wrote it knowing very well how much of a risk his life is, and including his family. For him to be even shot outside of his home means that no one is safe, including his family members and including the family members of any senior SAPS officer here that is particularly dealing with high-profile cases.
Now, Athi, we know that Zane Killian was tracking the cell phone of Kinnear. We know now that he does own a tracking and investigations company, and that he also works currently as a debt collector. Do we have any reason for motive and how he is linked to this entire murder, specifically considering the fact that the individual who was seen in the CCTV, as you pointed out, when that story broke and when that footage was released, was not Killian?
Well, Tammy, at this stage, this case is very sensitive. Even the police don't want to, speak about it without giving the facts. And if I were to say to you, this man that now has been arrested, Zane Killian, is linked to a conspiracy that has been formed to murder Lieutenant Charl Kinnear, that would be, of course, speaking without facts, because this case is still at a very sensitive stage. They are still investigating it. What we know from the state is that Zane Killian made it possible for Lieutenant Charl Kinnear's phone to be hacked, in that they could be able to track his movements. And of course, reports have been coming in that Zane Killian, this former professional rugby player, was also a debt collector for Nafiz Modek. Nafiz Modek is the same person that I mentioned earlier on, who's known to be the kingpin for organized crime in the Western Cape. He's linked to all the extortion cases that are happening in and around the city, where he's allegedly forcing some of the restaurant owners to pay protection fees. There's several cases against him. He's very well known to be the leading mastermind of some of the organized crime cases here in the Western Cape. He is also someone that was also investigated by the late Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear, because he has been looking at his movements throughout the organized crime syndicate here in the Western Cape. So that will obviously come out, Tammy, more and more as we, of course, sit in and listen in on the court proceedings for this particular case.
Certainly a multifaceted, multi-dimensional case, this one. Athi, thank you so much. That's our Athi Mtongana, who's out in Cape Town at the memorial service of the late Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear.